Good afternoon and welcome to another Humphrey Summer Seminar Series. This is our next week is our last one of the summer, which is crazy to also mean that means the school year is right around the corner. It's amazing how fast the summer went. Today we are so fortunate to have a conversation around COVID-19 and the globally displaced, the pandemic's impact on refugees and other forced migrants. We're welcoming back Diplomat-in-Residence Mary Curtin, who was with us a couple weeks ago. So we're excited to have her. She's going to moderate this time. And we have Refugees International President and former Dean Eric Schwartz, as well as incoming faculty member Dipali Mukhopadhyay. We're very excited for this conversation. Next week is the final seminar, so make sure to tune in next Thursday. And we're doing something a little different than what we've done with all the seminars so far. We're actually turning it over to our MHR students, and we're gonna hear a little bit from those coming out of the classroom about the work that they've been doing. So thank you again for joining us today, and I'm gonna step back and turn it over to Mary. Thank you.
Thanks, Keith, for that introduction. And I'm really thrilled to be back here today to talk with two of my colleagues about the impact of COVID-19 on the globally displaced. As Keith said, I'm the Diplomat-in-Residence at the Humphrey School of Public Affairs and came to the Humphrey School after 25 years in the Foreign Service, where I actually worked on several occasions with one of our panelists, Eric Schwartz, who comes to us as currently president of Refugees International. He has decades of experience in human rights, refugee, and humanitarian affairs, including at the National Security Council in the Clinton administration, with former UN Secretary General Kofi Annan, as Assistant Secretary of State for Population, Refugee, and Migration Affairs in the Obama administration, and as the UN Deputy Tsunami Envoy. He started his career with Human Rights Watch, and he was Dean of the Humphrey School until 2017 when he became President of Refugees International. He's on leave from his position as professor at the Humphrey School, but remains deeply engaged with our students. He has, in particular, a lot of very hands-on experience in managing humanitarian crises. Professor Dipali Mukhopadhyay has just joined the Humphrey School as an associate professor in global policy, and we're really excited to have her here at this event today as one of her first sort of official engagements as a member of the Humphrey School faculty. She's currently a gender expert on the Afghanistan peace processes with the U.S. Institute of Peace, and she spent 8 years on the faculty at Columbia University School of International and Public Affairs. She's the author of several works on conflict-related issues, including Warlords, Strongmen Governors, and the State in Afghanistan, and with Kimberly Howe, Good Rebel Governance, Revolutionary Politics, and Western Intervention in Syria. She earned her doctorate from the Fletcher School at Tufts University and her BA in Political Science from Yale University. So as I said, it's really great to have one of my newest colleagues at the Humphrey School, and someone with whom I have worked since, I would say, 1995, when we worked on the UN Conference on Women in Beijing together at the State Department and NSC, respectively. So I would like to ask Eric first to maybe give us your thoughts on this aspect of the COVID crisis that doesn't get a lot of attention. In your work at Refugees International, I know you think about this crisis every day, and you're a leading voice for the importance of all of us, our governments, us as individuals, to be engaged and to not forget this part of the crisis. Could you talk a little bit about the scope of the problem for refugees and migrants?
Sure. First, what a pleasure to be here, and what a pleasure to be with one of the Humphrey School's newest faculty members, and with you as well, Mary. I am so delighted Dipali, that you're going to be joining the Humphrey School faculty. It's just, I think it's great news for the school. And I didn't know this was your first public engagement with the Humphrey School, so all the better. I'll talk for about 5 minutes, and I'm going to share the screen only, nothing, nothing profound, but I always think it's a little bit more interesting when you have something to look at other than my face when you're doing this sort of thing. So let's see if I can do this. So far, so good. Let's see. Look at that. Okay. Can you all see it? Hello? Hello?
It looks good.
It's good. Oh, okay, terrific.
It's good, yep.
All right. Well, as many of you are aware, there are some 80 million people around the world who are forcibly displaced as a result of conflict, persecution, human rights violations. More than 26 million are refugees who have fled across borders of their countries of origin. And more than 45 million are displaced within the borders of their home countries, internally displaced people. And these populations, as well as others who are in the poorest 10% of the world's population, have particular vulnerabilities with respect to the COVID-19 pandemic. Population density, lack of access to basic services, often fragile health conditions, limited access to information, including limited access to information on public health, very fragile supply chains, all combine to create very grave risks for the displaced globally in the context of this pandemic. These are Rohingya refugees in Bangladesh back in 2017, right after the forced expulsion of hundreds of thousands of Rohingya into Bangladesh. In fact, in much of the global south,
Eric, can I interrupt you for 1 second?
Sure.
We're still seeing the first slide.
You are?
Yes, so if you could
How about now?
advance. Yeah, no, still seeing the first slide.
I did advance it.
Okay, on the screen, we still see just the title slide.
Isn't that interesting? Hold on, let's see. That's all you, okay. How about now? Is that better? Do you see it now?
No.
Huh. Well, I was in
There you go.
screen
Okay,
share.
that's it now. But maybe, yeah, we did not see the second slide, but
This
yeah,
one.
there we go. That's the second slide that you were talking about. Yeah.
All right. Well, maybe we'll just do it in this form. Is that okay? And
Yeah,
then we don't
whatever
have to.
works. Yeah, yeah.
Yeah. Well, let's just test it one more time. We're all friends here, right? How about now? Can you see the UNHCR slide?
We see the second slide with the statistics.
How about now? A third?
No.
Okay.
You had
right.
it.
Beg your pardon?
You had it a minute ago, and then you switched it back to the second.
Okay. Is that the third now?
No.
Cox's Bazar?
No.
No, you don't see it. Isn't that interesting? All right. So we'll do it this way. You can see that, right? You can see the UNHCR slide now?
We see it on a sidebar only.
You don't see my cursor
Cursor
circling?
moving, yes.
Okay, so why don't we just keep it like that?
Okay.
And then I'm presuming you see Cox's Bazar now? All right, so we'll I'm sure there's somebody in the audience who could have figured this out for us, but I think for now we'll just go with this. Is that all right? Okay, good. So here are the statistics, right? The 80 million refugees, forcibly displaced persons. And then there are, about 26 million refugees, about 46 million or more internally displaced persons, most of whom, interestingly enough, don't live in camps. Most refugees don't, and most IDPs don't. That's relevant to this issue, to the COVID-19 issue. So, in fact, in much of the global south, only relatively small numbers of the displaced have thus far tested positive for COVID-19. Now, why is that? Testing is limited, due to capacity constraints. Testing is limited due to conflict in places like Syria and Yemen. Testing is limited due to misinformation that deters people from being tested. Nonetheless, there are already hundreds of thousands of cases of COVID-19 in each of a number of the countries in the global south. And it is clear, and we can talk about that, that the worst is yet to come. So we have, are you all seeing, Mary, are you seeing the next slide? Good, okay. At Refugees International, we've pivoted to focus extensively on COVID-19 and the displaced. This is our first major report done in March. We've probably done dozens of reports, issue briefs, advocacy papers, et cetera, on COVID-19. But this small sampling of reports, which is probably not even readable, does reveal that most of our concerns around COVID-19 are not yet related to the direct effects of the spread of the virus, but rather due to its indirect yet still dramatic impacts. These include increases in gender-based violence globally. They include backsliding on efforts to include refugees in the labor markets and the economic lives of host countries where they have lived and where they are living. It includes dramatic reductions in food security and well-being due to restrictions on access, restrictions on supply chains in places like the Sahel, Mali, Burkina Faso. And in the case of US policy, we've reported and we've advocated against Trump administration policies that really have used the pandemic as a pretext to expel asylum seekers. So, and this is a really important point. It's that the COVID-19 has already had a dramatic impact in the global South. And it's not because of the increase in the incidence of people who are directly affected by the virus. It is largely due to these indirect yet dramatic impacts. I'm also very disturbed, as many people are, about what history will view as a tragic failure by wealthy countries who are so focused on their own situations that they really have failed to respond to a global imperative. Just to give you a sense of the dimension of this challenge, the UN's Emergency Relief Coordinator, Mark Lowcock, has said that COVID-19, if left unmitigated, could infect over 600 million people and kill nearly 2 million people in the world's most vulnerable countries. He's also emphasized that the indirect impacts of the pandemic, as I just have, on efforts to address HIV, tuberculosis, malaria, the specter of multiple famines. And he's estimated that the cost of protecting the most vulnerable 10% of the world's population would be about $90 billion. Now that seems like a lot of money, but his organization has also, OCHA, has also estimated that this would represent, that $90 billion would represent less than 1% of the amount of world stimulus packages that the rich countries of the world have begun to implement. In other words, to protect the poorest 10% of the world's population from the worst effects of the pandemic would require a global investment of less than 1% of what rich countries are spending. So I think that's a really important point, because we're having so much difficulty getting the Congress to focus on a very generous supplemental provision that would include large amounts or appropriate amounts for the global South. And finally, let me not miss the chance to emphasize a related issue, the importance of access to affordable and effective treatment for COVID-19, as well as access to a vaccine after one or more are developed. Our values certainly demand no less, but really so do our interests, as this is a virus that really knows no borders.
Thank you. Those are very sobering statistics and sort of insights into the problem. I'd like to ask you, Dipali, to maybe delve deeper into the realities that, as Eric alluded to, these displaced populations already were living in crisis. And your work has taken you to many areas where those crises have already been underway. And you've seen some interesting aspects of the COVID pandemic on those. Could you just talk to us a little bit about your observations to that situation?
Sure. It's such a pleasure to be here and to see 37 folks whose faces I can't see, but it's lovely to know that we're all together, and I'm so happy for this to be my first occasion to participate in an event with the Humphrey School, and what a joy to do it with you, Mary, and with Eric. I had the interesting, and I think, kind of illuminating experience of being in Kabul, Afghanistan at the beginning of this pandemic. So I was there for the first bit of March, and then to fly from there home to New York City. And so the contrasts were sharp, and I'm sure we'll get into, some examples going forward in the conversation. But I think, as Eric suggested, for many societies like those living in Afghanistan and Syria, COVID-19 was a kind of straw that has threatened to break the camel's back of a whole number of other challenges that are economic and social that already existed, not to mention the fact that in a country like Afghanistan or Syria, there's active war ongoing, which is yet another dimension. And so for people and their governments in places like that, they were already existing in a space of profound precarity. I think that, one of the things that I observed is an unexpected, for me anyway, kind of silver lining to the fact that these communities were already existing in such precarious terms, which is that they were used to, in many ways, sort of managing various forms of suffering and uncertainty, and also recognizing that they needed to find ways to take care of themselves in the face of dysfunctional government, weak government, predatory government. So I think, unlike Americans, they weren't surprised when their governments didn't provide all of the answers. And even within the first week of March, I could see that in Kabul, that friends and colleagues of mine were already beginning to find other ways of thinking about how to prepare themselves for what was coming. And, I've been, as you mentioned in the introduction, thinking quite a bit about rebel governance in Syria, thinking about wartime governance in Afghanistan. And I've been interested in this idea that people manage their affairs and look to their leaders in quite different terms when they're in the midst of a violent conflict, and the uncertainty and the struggle and the suffering that come with that. And I think in a lot of ways, life during a pandemic is sort of analogically quite similar. And so that might be why some of the populations in the most hard hit spots in the world in general, I think are actually managing, responding, and adapting in ways sometimes more ably than we are in the US. So, the last thing I would say on this is, I think, to start, is that there are some problems that cannot be solved by a massive military arsenal or cutting edge technology. And in those types of problems, and a pandemic is one of them, I think climate change, massive migration crises are others, they require a kind of communitarian mindset, so that a culture in which cooperation and what is good for the group, and the group gets very broadly defined, I think, in this case, that the good of the group is advanced at the expense of individual preference, individual privilege, individual comfort. And I think in many of the places where Eric and I work, that norm has been dominant for quite some time. And I think actually in this case, there are a lot of lessons for us who live in the US, for those of us who live in the US, to learn as we face down this problem and these other, I think, existential problems where similar modalities of response are going to be required. The last point I would make is that I'm struck at this moment that people around the world are not looking to the United States to solve their problems. They hope, as Eric alluded to, that we will embrace a mindset that recognizes that the solution to this particular problem is going to require taking care of each other in the global sense. But what I'm struck by is how stunned many of my interlocutors are in the developing world at how poorly we are addressing our own challenge here in the United States. And so I think as a scholar, it raises interesting questions about what does state strength mean in a context like this? What does it mean that we in the developed world tend to think about promoting governance in the developing world? I think the idea that the rest of the world has a lot to gain and learn from the West, which is often a mindset that we tend to adopt here in the US and in Europe, I think we might benefit quite a bit from destabilizing that mindset, given how challenging we're finding this in our own context, and how, in fact, I think we have quite a bit to learn from other parts of the world. So I'll leave it there for now.
Thank you. That it provides so much food for thought about how we think about how we as the United States and as the West respond in this. And Eric, I wonder if you might, if you have some thoughts about that. I know one of your issues, you just described it, that the West, the wealthier countries need to help address this issue. But I'd be interested in your thoughts to what Dipali has just said about that sort of imbalance that we may be seeing right now. You're muted. Can you turn your mic on, Eric?
Yeah, that was just as well, because it was almost a comment to myself. I said there's so much to talk about, but I'm going to try to limit my comments to just a couple of minutes. First of all, the idea that some people say, well, is this going to create an opportunity for increased local ownership of emergency response? The truth of the matter is, it is people who live in affected countries who are on the ground. They are first responders in crises, just by definition. So the notion that somehow we need to, transform that reality is built on sort of a very false assumption. And that was very clear in my experience in the tsunami response. So I think we have to stipulate that to start with. But then I don't think we can ignore, okay, so moving from there, I'll make two other points. Moving from there, does this crisis create opportunities or imperatives for a greater realization of a commitment made in 2016 at an event called the World Humanitarian Summit? And I noticed on your list of participants, there's some of my former students watching, so they'll remember this. But there was a commitment to that among the big international aid organizations and governments, that 25% of the funds, international funds in response to crises, would go through local and national providers. The world has gotten nowhere near that objective. And does an incident like this, does an event like this create opportunities for greater local agency and engagement? I think the answer is self-evident, because restrictions on access, make that need an obvious one. Internationals don't have as much freedom of movement. And so, I would say to some extent you can make some virtue out of necessity here. And we see examples of in places like Bangladesh, where local organizations have come together to try to meet the needs as they identify them. So all that I think could be encouraging. My final point, though, on the role of the United States, I would make a couple of observations. The United States' role on international humanitarian issues has not been completely pristine, but there was always this sense, historically, at least since the end of World War II at least, that if there were considerable resources required for an international response, the United States would play a leading role, and they would articulate aspirations for a global commitment, global engagement, and although the aspirations often, the reality often fell short of those aspirations, American leaders could always be held to account. You could always say to American president, you said you were, or American leaders, you said, or members of Congress, you said you wanted to do this, but you're not doing it, right? We don't live in that world anymore. And I think it'll be impossible to find anyone who would say that that the absence of a U.S. aspiration toward humanitarian leadership in this instance has not had a dramatically negative effect. It has. Now, thankfully, in terms of the regular supply of international humanitarian response, the Congress has pushed back on the Trump administration's efforts to dramatically slash overall humanitarian assistance. So the United States is still responsible for between a quarter and a third of world humanitarian assistance. That's a good thing. But I think we are in a very difficult international situation right now in terms of leadership, or even aspirations to leadership.
Thanks. I'd like to just back up a little bit to the reference that you made to like the local communities in Bangladesh, or to the donations going to local organizations, and to what Dipali mentioned earlier, that she has observed this resiliency among communities that are already used to those kinds of disaster. And I wonder, Dipali, could you just go into that a little more in depth and describe a little bit, because they're related but different things. Eric is talking about outside organizations providing funding to local community groups, and I think you're actually talking about this sort of self-resiliency that you have observed in some communities in which you have done work.
Yeah, I mean, I think this is such a powerful phrase I wrote down that Eric said, that people who live in affected communities are first responders. And, one of the experiences I had, I'll just share a personal experience I had, which is a dear friend of mine in Kabul is a dentist, one of the few female dentists in the country, and is well known in the city, as a result of that. And one of the things that became immediately clear in Afghanistan as COVID began to take hold, as Eric suggested, was that there was concern about the disease itself, but there was actually much more concern about the effects of a fairly strict quarantine that the government imposed quite early, in terms of depriving people of their opportunity to earn a daily wage, which, because people were reliant on literally earning the money each day that they would need to feed their families that night, that was as real, if not more significant of a concern for people. So this friend of mine, immediately, she and I got on the phone and, spoke about her concern about what was going to happen to communities, ranging from the guy who's selling rice pilau on the street and has X number of children, to a widow that she knew who's responsible for her own children, plus, let's say, her sister. You know, there are many examples of this, of extreme levels of poverty in which just one day of losing income is going to tip one over the edge. And what was fascinating about it was kind of a combination we found that worked very quickly of international response, which meant me and on Facebook telling people that I knew in my own community that I know someone who is in a position, because she knows a particular shopkeeper that she's built a relationship with over time, and has a sense they worked out together what a bundle of goods would look like that would get a family through 4 to 6 weeks. But the most important piece of it was the kind of trust that existed between her and that shopkeeper, between her and a set of people that then emerged in her own social network who could say, I know 10 families in this position. I know X number of people in my neighborhood who would that, and then they figured out systems by which they could come to the shop on a certain rhythm so that they wouldn't expose the shopkeeper, that they wouldn't expose themselves. And what I found just through this interaction, which was just between the two of us, that people all over the country began to do this in their own way. And it wasn't something that was broadcast particularly loudly, but very wealthy people were doing this in their own way. Friends of mine who are supporting their family month to month were doing it in their own way. And there was sort of a sense that these social safety nets that had been activated in the past during times of war, during periods of displacement, that they would get activated, and that the geography of how one thinks about one's own community was pretty flexible, you know, so it starts with your immediate family, then your extended family, but then it moves into your neighborhood, then it moves into the community that you came from in the province. And so I think, you know, that was really interesting to watch that mobilize, because it felt sort of like there's a muscle memory there of how to take care of one another that gets activated. And what I noticed was in my own community in New York City, that we didn't have that kind of knowledge. Those were new things that we began to think about. How can we look after elderly folks? How do we express our appreciation for essential workers? How do we begin to think about the clerks and, you know, folks that pick up our garbage and folks that drive buses and the subway? And I think that we didn't have that knowledge and that impulse and that intuition as naturally, but that began to arise, I found, in New York City in ways that were very quickly activated in a place like Kabul.
That's really interesting. And as we discussed the other day, you know, there has been some discussion about some sort of organic rise of community groups here in the Twin Cities, for example, in the wake of not just the COVID crisis, but some of the other related indirect or direct crises that came about because of the events that followed the death of George Floyd. But I'd like to kind of throw it back to Eric, and I'm going to just make as an aside for the listeners, we will start directly looking at some of the questions that you were putting up. So if you do have a question and want to type it into the Q&A box, we will get to those in just a few minutes. But Eric, I'd kind of like to come back to you because I think that those community responses are really important, but governments, especially wealthy governments, do have a role in addressing these issues on many levels. And you have talked about your concerns both of you talked about concerns about the US not being a leader. But I wondered, Eric, in the midst of all this, is there anything that you are seeing? You know, you also look at what other governments are doing or what the UN system is doing. Is there anything good, or can you talk about how you think the international community could continue to build on those kind of examples that Dipali mentioned? can you unmute? Yeah, thanks.
The one example that I think, and I've seen some of the questions, by the way, in writing, and they're great questions. So I'm looking forward to that part of the conversation. Look, it's very difficult because not only are the threats of transmission real, this is also an invitation to those in the an invitation to chauvinism, to political extremism, to nationalism, and so governments are in a very, very challenged situation. I think, the government of Colombia, for example, has hosted upwards of 2 million Venezuelan asylum seekers of one sort or another, many of whom now are heading back to Venezuela just because of the economic impact of lockdowns. And that government has made, I think, serious and substantial efforts at inclusion of a Venezuelan population. I remember I was in Venezuela. I was in Colombia at these trochas, where these informal border crossing points, and with Venezuelans just streaming in, and it was at about that time that President Trump announced that the annual U.S. refugee admission ceiling for 2019-20, perhaps, yeah, I think so, was going to be 18,000 refugees we would admit through our refugee resettlement program. And I noted at the time that's 4 days of migration from Venezuela into Colombia. And so the government there had made, as I say, serious and substantial efforts at inclusion, access to services, access to employment. Not perfectly, and there were measures that the government hadn't taken that it should have taken. And in light of the COVID pandemic, assuming the government of Colombia had the capacity, probably doesn't, but lack of capacity has never prevented governments from articulating draconian policy. And that government is making efforts, not to undo everything that it had sought to do by way of inclusion of Venezuelans over many years. And I think that's a model. I think we all have to accept the fact that governments feel very, very pressured, very, very constricted. On the other extreme is our own government, where our own government has seen this COVID pandemic as a perfect opportunity to use the fear of the other as a pretext to build up increasing walls against migrants and migration, so much so that as far as I'm concerned, the government, this is a government that has moved forward on policies that are designed to really end asylum as a practical alternative to somebody at our borders. But they've gone beyond that. The Trump administration has gone beyond that. We are.
See, Eric, you have frozen up. Oh, now you're back. Okay.
In its policy of deportation of Central Americans, we have effectively exported the virus, to countries.
Yeah.
The idea of people who are here, who might be vulnerable to the virus, who might have contracted the virus here, being deported in circumstances where adequate screening isn't taking place, it sort of baffles the mind. But so, governments have choices to make. Some are trying to do the right thing, others are not.
Thanks. Yeah, it's, and one thing that I think that's a really important reminder of is the fact that in terms of that sort of navel gazing that we talked about with COVID, we often do that, I think, also with refugee and displaced persons issues, where Americans or Europeans often think only about they think that all displaced refugees are coming to our country or our neighborhood or whatever, when the realities are that most refugees and displaced persons are either within their own country or in a neighboring country like Venezuelans in Colombia, or Syrian refugees in places like Lebanon and Jordan,
Afghans in Iran,
barely, sustain that. And very often, as in Syria or even Afghanistan, then you also have issues of governance. And so I'm curious, Dipali, because you mentioned early on, your work on, rebel governance and things like that. Have you been able to observe or have any sort of insights into how this crisis is then affecting it? What impact is it having in areas that are in the midst of conflict?
Yeah, I mean, there are a couple of things I would say on that. I mean, first of all, as I said at the beginning, the conflicts continue and the pandemic complicates the conflicts. But the pandemic also, for the reasons that Eric just explained, reveal the importance of government, right? And the importance of governance, and therefore provide opportunities for aspiring governments, which many rebel movements are, to try and demonstrate how they can step up and manage, and provide the kinds of public goods that are required to address a problem like this. So one thing that has been interesting to watch, for example, with the Syrian opposition, which while, in far reduced form from what it was when I started studying it, there is still a Syrian opposition. There is still an aspiring Syrian opposition government, and the commanding heights of that aspiring government reside in Turkey. And one of the interesting things that they call themselves the Syrian interim government, when COVID emerged, they put out statements that described their testing protocols. They made clear that they're opening up, they're outfitting a hospital within the small parts of Syria that are still opposition controlled in order to respond to COVID. And they also took the opportunity to highlight the incapacity of the Syrian Assad regime to manage the incredibly profound economic crisis that Syria finds itself in. And so they actually worked with the Turkish government to put the Turkish lira into the economy of parts of northern Syria. So what's fascinating is the ways in which, it becomes clear that only government can do certain things. And when you're talking about things like one of the questions I saw pop up in the Q&A is like, how do we think about how governments can actually respond effectively? And I think one of the fascinating things when we contrast the US government model with even some of the weakest states in the world, like the Afghan government, is that there's a sense that you need a kind of national response, right? There's a sense that there are certain baseline requirements that if everyone isn't doing them, the province or wide state, it's not relevant as far as the virus is concerned. And so I think what's interesting is to watch the ways in which different governments and, as I said, aspiring governments, rebel governors among them, are thinking about how to position themselves as the player that can begin to define a response for a particular area, and also the ways in which they will be held responsible by their populations. I mean, I'm working, as you mentioned in the introduction right now, on the Afghan peace process with the US Institute of Peace, and talks are about to begin in a matter of days, theoretically, between the Afghan government and the Taliban. And the degree to which, if the Taliban assumes some amount of governing responsibility, however that may work itself out, part of that responsibility will be the extent to which they are able to create conditions where healthcare can be offered and able to actually manage the means by which people are relating to one another to prevent the spread of the disease. That's an inescapable responsibility, whether you're an insurgent or a government. And I think that, that's going to be part of what will make this all negotiations around who is in charge, who is legitimate, who rules. This pandemic is going to be part of that equation.
And in your title, your role with U.S. Institute of Peace is, as I understand, the gender expert, and so that's another layer, right? Within those talks is within the COVID and the talks and that.
Yes, unfortunately, that's not my purview. I think that may have been a typo. That's okay, but yes, that's absolutely a very significant aspect, not only of the talks, which, we can get into, but of governance in general. I think, as I said, one of the really interesting things that I've watched happen in the response, whether it's from the government or from within communities, is the way in which something like a public health issue makes clear that questions around what are the boundaries of what government has a right to mandate and control. And in a lot of the communities that I study, those are questions that intersect very directly with questions around gender, right? So what decisions what policies get made and the ways in which they affect how households are organized, how education is organized. And all of that in that context also involves who are the officials, who are the caretakers, who are the healthcare providers. And in communities where, that may be why my friend, who's one of the few female dentists in the country, has such a role, such a salient position, even if it's an informal one, because we can't draw clear boundaries between what's public and private in a context like this.
Yeah, interesting. Eric, I wondered if you might be able to talk about one of the questions about the role of refugee diaspora to play in international policy, which I think is a really interesting twist on the usual way, which is talking about things like remittances that refugees send back. But what about the role on policy? How do you see that working? Oh, can you unmute?
Sorry about that. Hang on. Can you hear me now? Okay, it's a great question, but let me just quickly screen share this too. I alluded to this in my remarks. There's a report. I'm sorry. This is an earlier version. Devin Cohen just issued a report a couple of weeks ago on the impact of COVID-19, another indirect impact on issues surrounding women and girls in general, gender-based violence in particular. Based on lockdowns and lack of access to services in this area, we are seeing an increase in the incidence of abuses against gender-based human rights violations, and it's a real concern. This is an earlier iteration. There's a more recent report, which I obviously missed, on our website that Devin Cohen has issued. I think she published it probably about a week or two ago, and it's a critically important point. Now to get to your question, Mary, I think the principle, again, you respond based on your own personal experience in large measure. And right now, for us, I think, the principal role that diaspora refugee communities are playing, or a principal role, I think, is basically they represent a significant percentage of our frontline workers in this COVID response, and I think it's important that they have, that their voices be heard, but even more importantly, it is really essential that the American public understand the role that diaspora communities are playing, because it sort of gives, many of us have argued for years that being sympathetic and inclusive and welcoming the stranger is not only in our, it not only meets a moral imperative and reflects humanitarian values, but frankly is also in the economic and social interests of our country, however you define it. And this crisis really, I think, is providing, albeit anecdotal, we're in an academic environment, but graphic evidence of that proposition. So what we're trying to do through a special program of, with other non-governmental organizations, but out of our strategic outreach part of Refugees International, is getting those stories forward in as many ways as we possibly can, so that they can be part of the, part of the elevated political discussion in our country, and we can, continue in the effort to chip away at these prejudices, these distortions about the role of not only immigrants, but not only refugees, but more broadly, immigrants in American society. So that's the frame through which we're sort of addressing your question right now. And I think the past 4 years has made this much more of an uphill climb, because the president and his administration has a very loud and large bully pulpit. But I'm optimistic that we can effectively push back on that. And then, I mean, you push back on that with the goal of having that pushback translated into policy measures that are consistent with the objective of welcoming the stranger.
Thank you.
Can I
Dipali, did you have something to add on that? Yeah.
I do. I mean, I think this is such an important point. And, I think the other thing that it revealed, I said at the beginning, for this pandemic was sort of a straw that could break the camel's back for societies that are existing in real precarity. I think that Eric's point is, it's so important to shine that lens back on the United States and say that there are many communities within the larger country for which the same statement holds, right? Which is that these are communities in which, and many of them are populated by diaspora communities, by immigrants, by other minorities. You mentioned the intersection of the pandemic and the murder of George Floyd in as activating in the Twin Cities. I think there are many different ways in which we can understand, both to come back to Eric's phrase, that the people who live in these settings are the first responders. In our case, that is actually, they are the actual first responders. They were deemed essential workers for a reason. And they're living at the intersection of a number of different forms of inequity and therefore precarity. And in many cases, living in pockets of weakness, or living in pockets where their sense of trust for state institutions is as low as it might be in a district, in southern Afghanistan, for example. And so there's a lot of comparative work, I think, that we can do as scholars and students of public policy to think about what the lessons are that we can learn from other contexts in which we think about things like weak statehood or governing fragility, or sort of the intersection of a whole range of problems, including a public health crisis, that reveal that kind of precarity.
The web is a great thing, so I'm gonna do another quick screen share, I think this is sort of graphic evidence of example of what we're talking about here. I mean, this is a story. One of our communication staff about the role of an Iraqi dental surgeon, an Iraqi-American dental surgeon. And so I think there's a lot of good work that can be done here. And boy, you know, you guys at Humphrey are in what a place to do that work, right?
Yes.
I saw,
Yep.
you know, I spotted the list of participants, and you've got some participants who are very involved in these sorts of issues as well. And it's very encouraging.
We do. And you know, the other issue that is also very interesting, obviously, in terms of governance is, you know, we just had a primary here on Tuesday, and we see in so many ways the evolution of, you know, refugee communities from, you know, this sort of precarious situation as refugees to, you know, whether they're the Hmong community here, or Somali community, to moving into the political community and in a big way. And with the, you know, the impact of that still being a story that's being told here in the Twin Cities. And it is, it's very complex and very interesting. And it does bring questions of, you know, what role does that diaspora community play? So as you have business people in the Twin Cities then caring about what is going on, say, in Somalia, as well as caring about what's going on in their community here, it does, I mean, and that is sort of the American way. I mean, I grew up in an Irish American family that was very busy in terms of US policy toward that home country. So we just have a couple of minutes, and Dipali, I'd like you to just, you said that your contacts in other places are not looking to the US, and I was wondering, whom do you see them looking to as leadership, or do you see that going back to what you're talking about, sort of self-reliance?
You know, I think there's a tremendous alarm is how I would describe it. For my interlocutors, it's with no, I don't think they in any way relish the recognition that we're really struggling here in the United States with this response, and as the numbers of deaths climb, as the waves keep emerging, it's very concerning to them, but it's also something that they recognize as, or they hope, I think many of them, that it's not irreversible, that the U.S. role, you know, is complex and always has been, and in certain ways has always been admired, in certain ways has always been resented or feared. I mean, that kind of complexity has always existed. And I think there's a sense that there isn't necessarily some other power that steps in and fills those shoes, or that it becomes a vacuum. But I do think it's interesting to think about the notion, you know, let's say in the Middle East, for example, or in sub-Saharan Africa, what role the Chinese are playing, what role wealthy Gulf states might be playing, whether it's from, you know, providing PPE to testing. You know, I've heard all sorts of anecdotal evidence of different roles that are being played in that context. As I said, I think also thinking about non-state armed actors and the roles that, in the absence of, I mean, you know, the Islamic State lost its territorial hold before the pandemic took hold, but it would have been interesting to think about what role they might have played. So I think there's concern, and there's a sense that there's dynamism as well.
Unfortunately, we are going to have to wrap it up here with that response. There is so much that we could continue to talk about. And I really am looking forward to continuing to work with you, Eric, on these issues and engage with many of our students who are present in the conversation today, and very much looking forward to working with you, Dipali. And again, really excited about the opportunity that our students have to work with you as well. it really is so wonderful that they will have that chance to work with both of you as they think about and launch their careers into this really uncertain world. So thank you again for being here today. Thank you to all of our participants. And we look forward to seeing you next week when our human rights students will be talking about their activism. So thank you.
Thank you.
Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye, everyone.